Hello and welcome. My name is Kito Mann, and this session is called Advanced PrimeFaces. I apologize for not being there in person. I hurt my back over the weekend and doing a transatlantic trip because I'm in the US would be very difficult with a bad back. So we decided to do the streaming version. So thanks for coming. All right, so this session is called Advanced PrimeFaces. Can I get a sense from the room of how many of you are currently working with PrimeFaces? Okay, so a couple of you, okay. And how many people have never seen it before? Okay. All right, so I'll try, for those of you who are new to PrimeFaces, I'll try and give you sort of an overview, sort of an idea along the way. All right. So my name is Kito. I am the principal consultant at Virtua, where I do training, consulting, mentoring, etc. for PrimeFaces, JSF, Java EE, web components, etc. And we're also an official PrimeFaces partner in the US, so we do a lot of PrimeFaces training and consulting. I wrote a book a long time ago called JSF in Action, and I run a website called JSF Central. It looks really old because I built it years ago and have not updated the look, but it has some good articles about JSF. We just actually had an article about Boot's Faces, which lets you bootstrap with JSF, and Angular Faces, which actually integrates Angular with JSF. So you can check out jsfcentral.com for those. I'm the co-host of a newscast called Enterprise Java News, where we talk every month or two. We talk about random topics about the world of Java EE, and it's me and a couple other guys. One of them, Daniel Hinojosa, is big into Scala and different languages. Another person and myself are more front-end guys, but it's a good talk. And we usually end up with different guests. We just interviewed Chatai Sivici from PrimeFaces. We had Venkat Subramanian a couple months ago, and then the next one we're going to have Aaron Gupta, who is popular or just does a lot of evangelism in the Java space. So check that out if you like podcasts. I speak at lots of conferences, and I'm also a member of the Java community process. So I'm a member of the JSF expert group, as well as the MVC expert group and the Portlet expert group. All right, so that's my story. I'll just take a step back. For those of you who are not familiar with PrimeFaces, basically it is a set of user interface components for JavaServer Faces applications. So if you're building an application with JavaServer Faces, PrimeFaces is the most popular way to do it. Okay, and I'll just for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll run over to the showcase. Okay, so basically, oh weird, my screens just got confused here. Let me just see if I can fix them. Oh, well, I'll leave it for now. Okay. Basically, there's lots of UI widgets. And let me go to the main page here. Okay. And they all have very good Ajax integration. They're usually pretty easy to use. They're also very responsive these days. So you can get a UI which looks pretty good on different devices. They also support Ajax push, and there are also themes as well. Essentially, and this is open source, and you can also buy support. You've got everything from basic UI components like an autocomplete component, to other things like spinners. They just added which one is this? Switch. There's another one they just added that I thought was interesting. Knob. Yes. Yeah. This came from another project. So there's knob. Color picker, etc. And the way all these work is essentially using the standard JSF programming model. So here is this widget, okay? And you basically specify in your XHTML page, which is the way we template JSF applications, you specify the name of the component and its properties, and this is basically a binding to an object in some scope, usually in request scope or view scope. And basically what happens is you can either have this value be updated, if it's an input control like this, it can be updated either via a submit or an Ajax request as well. And there's over 100 different components. There's also a whole bunch of buttons. And there's also like some of the more nuanced ones, like, split button is a little different than just a standard button, you can define the menu. Okay, and the way the Java part of this is coded is that usually you have a class that's defined via CDI or Spring or JSF managed bean that has properties and methods which you can then reference in the UI. Okay, so here these are different methods which, if you pick this button and do update, it's going to call this method called update. And you saw there's that message that's updated up here. Okay. So that's and this is the message is being updated because there's this component here called growl, which is displaying the message. Okay. So that's sort of basically how all the JSF components work. And the difference between this and the client-side frameworks is that JSF is a server-side framework. So even though the components have a lot of JavaScript and CSS, you're still doing more interaction with the server and doing your kind of business logic or UI logic on the server in these what we call backing beans here. Okay. There's also other components. There's lots of data components. You've got your quintessential data tables that supports lots of different features, and the PrimeFaces data table is really one of the best ones out there. But it has, lots of the different sort of features you might expect in a data table component. Sorting, filtering, column reordering, stuff like that. And anytime anything happens, you can always get an Ajax event or a client-side callback to call some JavaScript. There's panels, overlays, menus, charts, multimedia, file, drag and drop, client-side validation. There's a dialog framework, which is kind of cool. So basically, this lets you send data between different, so it's not the best example, different sort of screens here, so it's sort of like a wizard setup. It's not really showing it, but there is sort of this dialogue framework between different pop-up windows that you can have. There's also charting, plenty of different charts. And again, all these work the same way. You basically specify the components, it has properties that you can set, and then there's usually some sort of data binding that you need. Here you need to specify all the different values that go into one of these charts. So these actually have a model object that you have to initialize in Java code. So there's lots of stuff there. The other thing which is nice about PrimeFaces, so it's an open source product. You can buy elite versions, which basically give you sort of supported versions with a lot of bug fixes. You can also buy support. And they also have these handy things which are premium layouts. So these are actually commercial. They're a couple $100, they're really cheap. But there are different themes and layouts. So they give you this basically a nice sort of modern look and feel that works across all of the components. And they also give you some sample pages. So you get like a login page, an error page, et cetera, et cetera. And also they develop using less, so they're pretty easy to change. So I've used these on a couple of projects. They're great if if you're starting a new project and you need a new, a really fancy looking theme, modern looking theme, and they're really affordable. So, for example, this is actually what this theme looks like. And these are all PrimeFaces components. It's just a different look and feel and some basic templates that you can use. And you can, of course, go and look and see what all these look like using this particular theme and layout. And they also give you these neat sort of starter pages. So they give you a little sample promotion page that you can just use out of the box and then, of course, modify to meet what you want. And let's see what else was there. There's sample dashboard pages, and there's a sample error page. Sample, not the best looking error page in my opinion, but they have sample error pages as well. So if you do use PrimeFaces, or you're thinking about it, this is one of the things to consider, is that this is just one of the themes. They have several of them. And they all have different looks and feels, are all responsive, so they look good in different browsers and on different devices. So this is the smaller viewport look. So you get the pull-out menu there. Okay. And all these, again, work on top of the standard components. They don't change the way they work. They just change the look and feel. Okay. So that's my quick PrimeFaces overview for those of you who are PrimeFaces newbies. I think I may be able to hear questions. Do you have any questions so far? All right.
Is there any way to use Ajax with request scope instead of view?
Oh, that's a good question. Is there any way to use Ajax with request scope instead of view? I would say that, not that I can think of off the top of my head, because at the end of the day, the Ajax request usually will be posting back to the same view. And so we'll expect to have that view state involved. It's a good question, though. I think you might be able to get away with it if you make your view stateless. It might work. JSF 2.2, I think, forward has stateless ability. That might work because in that case, it's not really going to be expecting to create a new view, or just create a new view for you. So you can try that. That might be an option, but I'm not 100% sure that'll work. Any other questions so far? Okay, so let's look at some of the more advanced things. So there's usually, or I've seen a lot of sort of intro PrimeFaces talks, and I've done some, but I wanted to take things a little bit further and do something a little bit more advanced this time around. I did also want to mention some new features, though, which are in PrimeFaces 5.3, which just came out. The main feature is responsiveness across all components, and this has been a big push of PrimeFaces recently to make sure it looks good on different devices. There's a new signature component, drag and drop support for mobile devices, over 100 bug fixes, etc. So if you haven't upgraded, and you can, you should go ahead and try upgrading to 5.3. All right, so I just wanted to look at a few classes which aren't always used that often, which are part of sort of the PrimeFaces core framework. Okay, so there's a few I want to talk about. Request context. Anyone heard of request context before? Okay, so one of you. Config container. Anyone heard of that one? Okay, and application context. Anyone heard of that one? Okay, that's kind of what I expected. So, inside of a PrimeFaces application, so I'm going to go to a very simple demo page here. All right, and I'm hitting the action button. Okay. And that's, as you can see, it actually, there's a callback here, so it's calling us some JavaScript handler. The action button is right here, and it calls a listener called myAction right here. It's very straightforward. And in myAction, I'm doing this. So the first thing is the request context. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very handy object that gives you access to do a whole bunch of things in the world of PrimeFaces. The number one use, in my opinion, is to add a parameter that you can send to JavaScript. So if you want to send some data back to your JavaScript code, use some custom processing in the JavaScript world, you can do so very easily with the request context. So in my action, what I'm doing is I'm calling this method add context, add callback param, excuse me. This is the name of my parameter, and this is the value I want to send. Okay. Now I could also add something else. Here I'm going to say random string. So if I want to just send a string, I can, just like this. If I want to send an object, I can wrap it in a JSON object and then put it in whatever object I want, and it'll be automatically serialized to JSON. Okay. So let's run this. Okay. And I hit action. And what happens here is I see this output, and I can see that there is my object, which is, this is a widget object that I had in Java. It serialized it so that I could send it to JavaScript, so now it's in the JavaScript portal. And then there's that random string as well. Okay. And basically the way you do this is in your XHTML page, you have a handler. Here's the onComplete handler. And basically you send in XHR, which is the XML HTTP request object, the status, and an args array, which is basically the arguments that are sent back from the server. Okay. So this args array is what has that param and the random message there. If I look at the JavaScript code, this is that process response method, okay, where I'm basically just logging the value here. Okay. So this allows me to really send data back and forth really easily in situations where I actually want more than, where I actually want to send something back to the JavaScript on the page, as opposed to just handling it on the server. Another thing I want to suggest that if you are writing some JavaScript to go with this, at the very least, if you're not doing anything fancy in JavaScript, put it in a namespace. So basically, this is saying declare a variable called global, or essentially it's an object, and with these properties or these methods. Okay, so at least now, if I want to reference this, I just say global dot whatever. And there's in my code is namespace, and it's not all in the global window namespace. I see that a lot in Java projects, and then you have like hundreds of methods which are essentially globally scoped. So just another pointer there. So that's the request context, but there's a little more you can do with it, right? So from here and the request context, these are all the different things I can get back from it, right? I can add the callback param. I can use it to integrate with the dialog framework, which is closed dialog method. I can execute a script. So if I did like execute, I could do that. There we go. So that's the script I sent back from the server. And let's see what else we can do here. Okay. There's all sorts of handy things, the request builder, but there's also useful things like, is it an Ajax request? Okay. Is it a secure request? You can open dialogues. You can also specify the specific components that you want to update via Ajax. So that's what this update is for here. Okay. So some handy stuff. And what I wanted to talk about was a couple other classes. So you see I can get this application context here. Okay. All right, so this is the application context. And it has a few methods. It has get the config, get the validator factory, which is used for bean validation, get the cache provider, which is used for the pcache component, which lets you cache parts of a page so that they're stored in memory and not reevaluated each time. And there's also a couple other caches which are used more internally. Okay. Now, what I wanted to show from this was the config context. So, config container, excuse me. All right, so here's the config object. This gives you some more information. So let's say you wanted to know what the error pages were, what the version was. Okay, the push server URL secret key. Is it client-side validation enabled? Is it least JSF22? So these are basically a lot of handy things which are used internally. They're also useful to know in your application, right? So if you need to know something like, if you want to know if you're using least JSF 2.2, if you want to print out the version of PrimeFaces, you want to get a handle to the error pages, all these things are available to you. Okay, so very useful information. Okay, any questions so far? Other questions? Okay. All right. So then there's this thing called Ajax, right? And we use this in PrimeFaces a lot. It's basically the way that we communicate with the server. And one of the things to keep in mind is that the PrimeFaces Ajax is a little bit different than standard JSF Ajax. The server-side APIs are exactly the same as any standard JSF Ajax library. But the client APIs are actually written in jQuery. Okay? So internally, PrimeFaces uses jQuery to do all of its Ajax requests. Okay? There's a couple nuances that this creates, which we'll get to in a minute. Also, in addition to the Ajax, there also are special PrimeFaces selectors. There's the ability to do auto update and partial submit, and callbacks as well. Okay. So one of the things to keep in mind is that when you're doing Ajax updates, you usually specify that you want to update a particular component on the page. But PrimeFaces has some handy extensions. So you normally say like update equals the name of the component, or at this, at form, etc. In PrimeFaces, you can do at naming container, which would usually be like a data table or a composite component. At composite is specifically a composite component. Parent means the parent component, and you can also jump to a particular child component, update that, or the previous component on the page, or you can reference the component by its widget var, okay, which is the name of the JavaScript variable on the server. All right, so you can actually have a lot. You actually have a lot of flexibility in terms of what you want to update via Ajax. Okay. So, as an example, this first one is the PrimeFaces. I'm sorry, this is the default JSF ability at form, right? But in addition to these PrimeFaces extensions that are on this previous page, you can also use these additional things, which are called PrimeFaces selectors, right? So you can say form.first. You can specify a particular style. This is all based on jQuery syntax, okay? So you can basically use sort of a jQuery selector to basically select components that you want to update via Ajax as well. Okay. Another feature is partial submit, and I believe we're going to add this to like a new version of JSF. I don't know if it's in the new version 2.3 or if we put it in 2.2. I honestly can't remember. But PrimeFaces has it now. And basically, there's one sort of nuance with JSF default Ajax, and that was that if you submitted a form and you're only updating, or if you're only processing one component on the page, it would still send all the parameters on the form. right? It was just like, I'll send everything, and then when you get to the server, you can decide what you want to process. The only problem with this is that if you have a very large form, which some applications unfortunately do, you're basically wasting a lot of CPU and network bandwidth because you'd be sending these really large requests when really you only need to send a couple things. So partial submit basically lets you send only the things that changed. So the same request would look like this using a partial submit from PrimeFaces. Okay, so this is a very handy thing to do. You can specify globally, and I encourage you to just turn it on. And if everything still works, then you're good. If there are some issues, you can turn it on and off in different cases. Okay, very handy, and it will speed up the performance of your applications. You can also control Ajax updates in different ways. So there's p-output panel, which you can use to automatically update part of a page via Ajax. You can also use it to delay loading part of a page to speed up performance. There is pfragment, which basically lets you keep Ajax or keep form submits and Ajax updates within a particular region of the page, which is very handy. And both of these have the auto update attribute. Also, other components like messages have auto update. And the main benefit there is that if you have some data that changes and that affects one of those components that has auto update set to true, you don't have to explicitly update them via Ajax. It can just happen automatically. So those are pretty handy. All right, so let me show you a quick demo of that. So this is an output panel, okay? And you see, essentially what's happening here is I put a delay in there so it would take a long time. So this data table was being loaded, and while it's loaded, that you got that little spinner thing saying that the output panel was deferring the loading of it. So that's a handy thing you can use in cases where you have different regions and you want to load the page really quickly and give the user, let the other more expensive operation take a little bit longer. And this is a very, very common thing you see in applications. That page looks like this. Okay. So here is the output panel, this panel right here. Deferred is set to true. And then inside we have an ordinary data table. There's nothing special about this. It just happens to take a little bit longer because I put a delay in this method, so it'll take longer to load. Okay, so that's a handy way to just speed up the loading of your page. Also, the fragment looks like this. Okay. So let's say I put some content in here, and this is in one fragment, and this is in another fragment down here. Okay. And I submit this value. So you see this is updating test, right? Now if I put 323 here, okay, and test 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm submitting this, but it's only updating this value here. It's not affecting this at all. So let's say I submit this, it updates this value, okay? And I change this to, let's see, submit that changes here. So you see these regions are not affecting each other at all, okay? And that's nice because they're actually on the exact same form. So a lot of times when you're working with a form, you know, data tends to be sent all together, right? But that first panel is in a P fragment, okay? And the second panel is in a P fragment. And you can see this output panel has update set to true, okay? So what's happening is we submit the value here, okay, in the top panel, and it auto-updates this section down here. Submit the value here, and it auto-updates this section down here. But they don't interfere with each other, so when you submit this fragment, you're not submitting this fragment either, even though they're all inside the, whoops, sorry about that, inside the same form, okay? Does that make sense? All right, good. Okay. So let's also take a look at PrimeFaces components themselves, right? So what actually makes up a PrimeFaces component? There's a few different things. Of course, you have your CSS, JavaScript, JSON, and Ajax being sort of the front end part of it, right? And you also have the backend functionality, right? Or the way that you work with it, which is the actual component tag itself and the properties it supports. A lot of the CSS JavaScript stuff isn't something you have to use, right? It's there if you need it. And the way you use it is usually by doing CSS overrides, using the JavaScript API, client callbacks, or Ajax callbacks as well. Okay? So you can actually do a lot of customization just by doing that stuff. But there are situations where you might want to do more as well. Okay. All right, so let's look at a component here. I'm going to pick a, let's use my calendar. I'm going to pick a fairly straightforward component, one called input number. Okay. Oops. There's actually, I'm trying to think if I want to get into that. There's one other thing I should mention. Before we get into this, I should also mention when it comes to Ajax, I'm going to go back to the initial page here. Back to mention. So here is Ajax, right? And here's the Ajax. I'm updating the page via Ajax. Obviously, this is not a very fast thing to do on a real server, but I'm updating the page via Ajax, right? Now, if I want, let's say I execute some operation, okay, and it blows up. So if you look in here, okay, this method is just going to throw an exception. Okay. So if that happens, and I don't have an error handler set up, let's say I get rid of this on error handler. Let's see what happens. Oops, that's the wrong button. Oops. All right, so I get an exception from here. Okay? And the only reason I'm seeing this exception is because I have turned on the PrimeFaces exception handler. Okay? So PrimeFaces has an exception handler like this. Also, OmniFaces does as well. Okay? And essentially, what this does is it's defined here. Okay? It basically will cache those exceptions for you and display them on the server. Okay? So it's generally good practice to make sure you have one of these. Otherwise, what can happen is you'll essentially get a silent exception on the server, a silent exception on the client, which you then have to try and handle as well. Okay, and the way you handle it is not always the prettiest way. So if you use the PrimeFaces exception handler, and there's also a corresponding component, you can basically have more control over how the errors in Ajax are handled. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. Okay. So back to the input component. So here is the input component. I just remember there was an issue with my demo, so I'm going to show you the PrimeFaces site. So input number is a pretty straightforward component. It basically will control what your input is based on what you put into it. Right? So this one, you can see I'm typing letters right now and they're not working, right? And here there's minimum and maximum values. So if I put in, 888, I can't type any more values there. So basically it lets you format a number in a handy way. Okay. And if we look at this component, you can see the way it is developed, or the way it is rendered, I should say, is like this. So there is this input element here, right? There's also this span, okay? This is the ID of the component. And it has a class, okay? So every PrimeFaces widget has a set of CSS selectors that work with it. So this has UI input number. It also has UI widget. So if you had a requirement that was like, hey, I need to style, UI input number in a certain different way, you could just change the CSS styles for UI input number. And if necessary, you could style some internal components for it as well, some internal elements. Okay. And this is true for all the components. And basically, there's what we call behavioral styles and sort of theme styles. Okay. So some of them are more behavioral ones, and some are more for a particular theme. But either way, they're pretty standard across different themes and things like that. So regardless of which theme you use, you can very easily use specific CSS selectors to style them appropriately. And honestly, there is documentation for these. It'll tell you what the CSS selectors are, but the easiest way to do it is just inspect it and see what they are. Because then you can also see, well, I also want to style, the input control inside of it or something like that as well. Okay. So inside of here, there's a couple more things. There's 2 input controls. There's this one. And this is the one that you actually see. Okay. So this is, let me scroll down here. So you see, let's go back. There we go. So this also has CSS selectors: UI input field, UI input text, UI widget, UI state default, UI corner all. Okay. So these are additional selectors you can use to style it. This is a hidden input field, which is used for some components. So even though you type stuff into this field, okay, this is the one that's actually submitted. So the JavaScript code does some work to keep these two in sync. All right. So that's what's in here. And if we were to look at the actual real code, we would see something else. And that is this here. Okay. So you can see here we're in PrimeFaces. Which basically is rendering this for the onChange event. And then here is where the actual widget is created. Okay? So this is where the code is that creates the client-side widget. So anytime the PrimeFaces component is rendered on a page, there's also a client-side widget which is used in addition to the server-side part of it as well. Okay? And you see what it's saying here. It's saying, okay, this is the name of the component, this is the ID, these are the properties, disable, value to render is this. Then it has this thing called plugin options. Okay? Now, this component in particular actually wraps a jQuery plugin. Some do, some don't. It depends on the component. Okay, so these options are being sent to the actual jQuery plugin itself. Okay, and the way all this works is using standard JSF features. So, if I were to take a look at input number Java, I see this class, and this is the actual component that's used for PrimeFaces. There's a hierarchy. This implements a couple interfaces, subclasses, and input control, HTML input text. Okay. Every component has a type and a family, and a default renderer. The renderer is responsible for actually displaying the markup. Okay, and these are the different properties the component has. All right. And this is the implementation of the properties. Okay. So that's the actual widget. On the server side, the renderer looks like this. So it has a few different things. It handles the conversion, which means converting the value that you sent from the browser to the server. Decoding, which does sort of the same thing, but it's basically looks at all the input that's sent from the browser and then sets the value on the right component. Also can handle events. And then encoding, and basically this is where all those spans, classes, styles, etc. are set up. Okay, so during the rendering process and the encoding process, that's when all the output that we just saw is basically set to the browser. Okay.
You have 4 minutes left now.
Okay, thank you. And the last part of a PrimeFaces component, if you look back here, you see these dependencies here. So this is basically saying this component requires the PrimeFaces CSS files, this PrimeFaces JS file, and it also requires this input number.js file as well. Okay. All right, and input number.js looks like this. Okay. And you see it actually, there's a whole hierarchy for the JavaScript widgets. Okay. So this is the base widget, there's an initialization function, and then there are methods which can be called on. So you can actually call methods on these in JavaScript as well to enable, disable, etc. on the client as well. Okay. And that's basically the anatomy of the component. All the components work like this. They have all these pieces: the server-side piece, the UI component itself. They have the renderer on the server, and they also have the JavaScript on the server. And usually there's companion CSS as well. Okay, so there should be a CSS file as well, which just has anything which are specific to this component. It's not much. Now, the one thing I want to point out is that you can actually customize them and fix bugs if you need to. Okay, so you can customize them by subclassing one of these components, and then you can actually replace the components that you just use in your application with your customized version if you want to. Don't really have time to show that, but I can show another thing which is a little bit simpler. You can also customize the JavaScript as well. Okay. And usually what I have in larger projects is a handy little file called like PrimeFaces patches or something that has anything that I'm using to customize PrimeFaces. It's not like I'm rewriting a component, but if there's a simple patch that I want to create. So I can just include this in my project, and I can very easily override particular features. So for example, this is actually my preferred method of extending a UI component on the client, is basically by sort of extending the component itself, which is kind of an interesting thing you can do in JavaScript. So I'm basically defining a new autocomplete component, okay? And it's just extending the current one, which is the default PrimeFaces one. And this adds support for pasting a value directly into the input field. Okay, so this is a feature that we didn't support, but we wanted to add this feature. So just like you would in Java, you call it a superclass, right? But here it's just super. We'll call this particular function. Okay, and then you can add whatever functionality you want. Okay, and the reason I knew what to add, I went and looked at the autocomplete JavaScript code, but I didn't want to modify that code directly because I don't want to mess up. I don't want to have to worry about synchronizing that. I put everything in my PrimeFaces patches file, and then I can just override specific things I need to. Okay. So this is a very handy way to make changes when necessary. Okay. You see we've done this a few different times. When there's something, this is adding one method, which is another thing you can do if you just need to add a method or override a method completely. You can do it this way as well. So there's lots of different interesting things you can do there. All right, so it looks like I'm about out of time. But I do encourage you, if you're working on PrimeFaces, that don't always think about it in terms of exactly what the component suite provides. You can build on top of it. You can customize it. You can extend the components. You can fix bugs. You can change the behavior, add a feature, etc. It's a really, really powerful framework, and there's lots of things you can do. Okay. All right. So I think I went through all this stuff. Okay. So I don't think I have anything else. I went over the theme stuff a little bit. There's different things you can do with the structural CSS versus the other CSS, and I think that's about it. So see if I have a final slide here. Yeah. All right. So here's my final slide for you. All right. Okay. So if you are interested in support, training, or consulting, PrimeTech is the place to go. You can get there from the PrimeFaces.org site. And then also in the US, we do stuff as well, training and consulting as well. I don't know if I have any time for questions, but thank you all for coming. And if you need to get in touch with me, I'm at Kito99 on Twitter.